So now is the scripture reading Psalms 86, verse 1 through 12, in page 423 of your Old Testament Pew Bibles. Incline your ears, O Lord, and answer me, for I am poor and needy. Preserve my life, for I am devoted to you. Save your servant who trusts in you. You are my God. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for to you do I cry all day long. Gladden the soul of your servant, for to you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. For you, O Lord, are good and forgiving, abounding in steadfast love to all who call on you. Give ear, O Lord, to my prayer. Listen to my cry of supplication. In the day of my trouble I call on you, for you will answer me. There is none like you among the gods, O Lord, nor are there any works like yours. All the nations you have made shall come and bow down before you, O Lord, and shall glorify your name. For you are great and do wondrous things. You alone are God. Teach me your ways, O Lord, that I may walk in your truth. Give me an undivided heart to revere your name. I give thanks to you, O Lord my God, with my whole heart, and I will glorify your name forever. Now I invite Pam up.
Psalm 86, I really like verse 1 and 6 and 7. Hear me, Lord, and answer me, for I am poor and needy. Hear my prayer, Lord. Listen to my cry for mercy. When I'm in distress, I call to you, because you answer me. In the Contemporary English Version Bible, Lord, listen closely to me and answer me, because I am poor and in need. Listen closely to my prayer, Lord. Pay close attention to the sound of my requests for mercy. Whenever I am in trouble, I call out to you, because you will answer me. One more version. Pay attention, God, to my prayer. Bend down and listen to my cry for help. Every time I'm in trouble, I call on you, confident that you'll answer. Growing up, I heard a lot about the power of prayer from my dad. I don't think I totally understand the potential in prayer, but I have this deep-seated pull to that power. A pull that I know I don't fully tap into. So when I decided to preach a 3-part series on prayer, I wasn't real sure how to put it all together. And I know that you've probably heard this story of the father who was walking past his daughter's room as she was praying. She was kneeling by her bed, praying, and he walked past and he just kind of stepped in because he wanted to hear what her prayers would be. And he stepped in and he heard A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and she recited the whole alphabet. And then she started over and started reciting it again. And he didn't want to interrupt her prayer, but he just said, "Honey, what are you doing?" And she said, "Well, I'm praying." And he said, "Well, why are you reciting the alphabet?" And she said, "Well, I started my prayers, but I wasn't sure what to pray, so I just decided to say all the letters of the alphabet and let God put it together, because God knows best." Now that's a story, but there is a real account in the book Approaching God by Steve Brown. A gentleman had just joined the church, and he was rather anxious to learn how to pray. He tried and he tried, but he always felt like his prayers weren't getting higher than the ceiling. He found a book on prayer, And he was so excited because now he would know how to pray. And as he was telling about the experience, he related that he followed what he thought the book was saying, and his prayers still seemed to go no higher than the ceiling. He threw the book away. And months later, he entered a really rough and painful patch of his life. And he said, the only good thing that came out of that part of my life is that my prayer life is dynamite. When they asked what rules he had followed, he said, oh, no rules. I was too scared to remember the rules, and so I just told God that. I like that. I like that image, because we don't have to remember the rules. We just admit to God where we are. We seek the source. So I went and I picked 3 people from God's history, people who might have been too scared to remember the rules, and told God that. I chose Elijah, Esther, and Ezra. Now, I know they all start with E's, and that has nothing to do with it, other than we could say people of prayer, but you'll see later why I picked those 3. Let's start with Elijah. So if you go to 1 Kings, Elijah just kind of enters the story without introduction. He enters the story when Ahab is king and Jezebel is queen. In 1 Kings 16, we read that Ahab made all the evil kings before him look like amateurs. In 1 Kings 17, Elijah approaches Ahab and says, you know what? Things are not going great here. There's so much evil going on that I am going to say there'll be no rain or dew in the next few years except at my word. This is kind of a big deal, because Elijah just walks in and says, there's going to be no rain in the face of Ahab and Ahab's god Baal, because Baal was the god of rain and bountiful harvest. Elijah was not popular, and if you look at his journey the next couple years, he hides by a brook, he's fed by ravens. When the brook dries up, he goes to Zarephath and meets a widow who's fixing her last meal for her son, and she's using her last bit of flour and her last bit of oil, and Elijah asks for part for that meal. And she gives it to him, and then she never runs out of oil or flour. However, her son dies. But Elijah prays and brings him back to life. That's all in 1 Kings 17. Well, 3 years later, Elijah is on Mount Carmel, and he challenges the prophets of Baal, remember, to a fire-off, where they both put their sacrifices on the altar, and he says, whoever can call down fire from their God, that's the God we will recognize. And if you remember the prophets of Baal, they tried and they prayed, and Elijah kind of taunted them and said, maybe you should pray louder. And so they were praying louder and louder, and the fire didn't come. And then Elijah said, you know what? I want you to pour water on my altar here, pour water, pour it again, and they pour water 3 times. And then Elijah prays to his God, our God, and the fire comes down and consumes it all. Queen Jezebel was not happy about all this, because Elijah had really embarrassed the prophets of Baal. She vowed to kill Elijah, and he ran for his life. He sat under a bush, and he prayed that he would die. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I'm no better than any of my ancestors. And he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. And God woke him up, God fed him, let him sleep again, and then God told him to go to Mount Horeb. This is where we pick up the story. Elijah goes to Mount Horeb, and he tells God, you know, I've had a passion for you. I've served you, The Israelites have abandoned your covenant with them, and they've torn down every one of your idols, your altars. I am the last remaining prophet, and they will seek and execute me as well. And God said, leave this cave and go stand on the mountainside. My presence will pass by. So Elijah went and stood. And there was a great wind, crumbled every stone, but God was not in the wind. And there was a great earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. And there was a fire, but God was not in the fire. After the fire died, there was nothing but the sound of a calm breeze. And through this breeze, a gentle, quiet voice entered into Elijah's ears. Elijah covered his face, and God said, "Why are you here, Elijah? What is your desire?" Elijah said, "You know my passion has been devoted to you. The Israelites have abandoned your covenant. They've torn down every one of your altars. They've executed all your prophets, and I am the last remaining prophet, and now they seek to execute me. They won't stop." And then God showed Elijah that there were more God followers than he thought. And he also met Elisha, who became his right-hand man and successor. Elijah was a man who knew the mountaintop, and he knew the low valley. And Elijah hears God in the still, small voice. I have a saying framed in my house. It says, "Make time for the quiet moments as God whispers and the world is loud." Make time for the quiet. Skip forward 365 years to Persia, 100 years after Nebuchadnezzar had taken the Jews captive, and after Zerubbabel had led the first group of exiles back to Jerusalem. Esther, her relatives must have been among the exiles who chose not to return, even though a decree had been made that allowed them to do so. The Jewish exiles had great freedom at this time in Persia, and many remained because they were established and they feared the journey back. So we enter the story at the banquet of King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes as he is also known, and much easier to say. So we're at the banquet of King Xerxes, and he wants Queen Vashti to show off her beauty. There's a very interesting exchange between the king and his council in Esther 1. But she refuses, and she is dequeened. The crown is taken away, and the process for a new queen starts. Esther, a Jewish girl adopted and raised by her cousin Mordecai, was one of the young women chosen to be in the choosing of the queen. Upon the advice of Mordecai, Esther chose not to tell that she was Jewish. She chose to hide her Jewish background. So we get there, and Esther's queen, Xerxes is king, and a man named Haman was promoted in the king's council. And it was decided that all people should bow down to him. And they did, except for Mordecai, who refused to give a man the honor God deserves. Well, Haman didn't like this, and since Mordecai was Jewish, he decided to eliminate all of Mordecai's people, and he named a day that all the Jews would be killed. Well, Mordecai went into mourning. He put on the sackcloth, put ashes on his head, and he went out into the heart of the city and cried out loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because you could not go past that if you were in clothes of mourning. Well, they noticed this, and word went to Esther, and she sent out everyday clothes for Mordecai to put on, and he refused. She then sent one of her people of her court, Haddock, and she ordered him to go to Mordecai and find out what is going on. So Mordecai told the queen's servant everything that had happened, and he gave Haddock a copy of the order for mass murder of the Jews. Mordecai said, "Show it to Esther. Tell her everything I've told you. Convince her to go before the king and plead for his favor, not only for her life, but for the life of her people." Haddock returned to Esther and told her everything Mordecai had said. And Esther said, "Return to Mordecai and tell him, how am I supposed to see the king? It's known throughout the land that whoever wants permission to see the king, and they approach the king in the inner chambers without being invited, is a sentence of death. That's the law, and there's only one exception, that if the king were to hold out the gold scepter to that person and spare his or her life, and it's been 30 days since the king has summoned me." Well, Mordecai said, "Tell Esther, don't be fooled. Just because you're living inside the king's palace doesn't mean that you, out of all the Jews, will escape the carnage. You must go before the king. If you stay silent during this time, deliverance for the Jews will come from somewhere. But you, my child, and all of your family will die. And who knows? Perhaps you have been made queen for such a time as this." So Esther says, "Tell Mordecai, in preparation for my audience with the king, do this. Gather together all the Jews and fast. Fast and pray for me. Intercede for me. For 3 days and nights, abstain from all food and drink. My maids and I will join you in this time, and after the 3 days, I will go into the king and plead my people's case. Even if it means I will die." Esther goes to the king. He accepts and offers her the symbol of the gold scepter, and the Jews are spared. So we have Elijah, a man who's been to the mountaintop and been to the lowest valley, and he hears God in a still, small voice. Esther, an unknown Jewish girl, asks others to intercede with her so her people are spared. We have a still, small voice, and we have interceding prayer. So 16 years later, King Xerxes' son is king, Artaxerxes, and he gave permission for people to return to Jerusalem. It was a proclamation that they could be on their way to go back to Jerusalem. In Ezra 8, we read that Ezra is leading this caravan, and they come to the river Ahave. They humble themselves before God, asking for a safe journey for themselves. Safe journey for themselves, their children, and their possessions. Ezra says, "We needed his protection more than ever, since I had been ashamed, or I considered it inconsistent to ask the king for military escort of soldiers and horses on our journey, because I had told the king, our true God takes care of anyone who follows him, but he will use his power and anger against anyone who abandons him. We knew fasting and following our true God would ensure that he helped us travel safely to Jerusalem. And God did. Ezra doesn't pretend everything is fine. In fact, he admits he's second-guessing his decision to tell the king that he didn't need the military escort because God would protect him. If he asked now, it would not be consistent with his words to the king. So Ezra reminded himself it was not by his power, but to stop and seek the source of power. And seek the source of power together with all the people. These are just 3 places in history where we see ordinary people learn to seek the source of power, the power of prayer. And they step out in that power. Elijah came from the high mountaintop to the low valley and learned that God was in the still, small places of listening. Esther, who really didn't want people to know who she was, invited those around her to join in petitioning to the source of power. And Ezra, who wanted to depend on his God and realized he needed to seek that source of power together with his people. So for these 3 people, we are reminded to seek the source of power. The source of power that Elijah, Esther, and Ezra drew on. Seeking God in the still when the world is loud. Seeking God for others and seeking God with others. We too are invited and encouraged to seek the source. How do you need to seek that source this week? Is it in listening to the stillness? Is it in praying for others? Or is it praying with others? Or hopefully a combination of those 3. But let's intentionally pick at least one of those ways to seek the power, to seek the source of power this week. To seek the power of love, the power to forgive, the power to live with Christ, with God's presence within us. Like Elijah, we have times when we see God magnificently at work, and we have times when we are discouraged. Like Esther, we have times when we want to hide from who we were called to be, and sometimes we just want to blend in. And like Ezra, there are times we just want to rely on ourselves. So in our humanness, let's ask God to empower us with God's Spirit, to live out God's love, to rely solely on God. We ask God to help us live in that power. We ask God to help us seek that power. We ask God to help us step out in boldness and with courage to live out the power of love for all. Amen.